Welcome to Real Rockford Files, tales of the paranormal, supernatural, and the flat-out unbelievable. Today I'll be sharing ghost stories from Missouri. Let's get into it. Story 1. I had an interest in unexplained phenomena by the age of 9 and loved to listen to my parents read ghost stories or hear ghost stories around the campfire at Girl Scouts, but did not think that I would ever see a real ghost myself. One evening that would change. I was 11 years old and living in my parents' home in the Brookside neighborhood in Kansas City, Missouri. Brookside is an old neighborhood with large craftsman-style homes, and I'm sure there are many spirits roaming around there, but on this night, it would be a relative that I would see. After a Saturday evening at home, having dinner with the family and playing Monopoly, my younger sister and I headed to bed in our shared room upstairs. Her bed was across the room from mine. It was dark that night with a bit of moonlight coming in through the windows. We were a little bit wound up and were just talking softly when suddenly a mist began to form about 6 feet in the air just beyond the foot of my bed. I just quietly watched it form into a head of a man with clear features. It had a narrow nose, high forehead, and piercing eyes which seemed to stare right through me. I kept my composure, curious about what this was that I was looking at, when the head began to talk. I could not hear anything, but could clearly see words being formed by the mouth. It was speaking to me. At this point, I needed confirmation and asked my sister, "Do you see that thing floating at the foot of my bed?" My sister opened her eyes and looked to see the same thing, only being a bit more fragile than me, she screamed. Then I screamed. My father and brother ran up the stairs, flipped on the light, and Dad said angrily, "What is wrong?" The head disappeared when the light went on. I did not know if I should be scared or disappointed that it was gone. We explained what happened, and my father asked me what the apparition looked like, then went downstairs to get a photo album that I had never seen before. He asked me to look through it and see if anyone in it looked like the head of the person I saw. Sure enough, after browsing through, I stopped at the picture and said, "That is him." It turned out that it was my father's father, who died in 1950, 6 years before I was born. That was my in-your-face introduction to the spirit world. I've had many encounters with ghosts since then, but I will never forget the first. Story 2. I live in the city in an old Queen Anne-style house that is quite large, built in 1902. There is a staircase in the back near the kitchen that I believe the servants use that go up to the third floor. The front staircase just goes to the second floor. Approximately 3 years ago, as I was walking down the back staircase, right in front of my eyes was an animal that was huge, totally black, sleek with a long tail. Just its body alone filled up the doorway that leads into the kitchen, and the doorway was wide. At first, I thought that a stray dog had come into our house and felt a jolt of panic. We had 4 dogs at the time. I could not see the head of this animal, as its head was already past the door frame. I then realized it was not a dog, but a large cat. It walked so gracefully, yet there was an extreme power emanating from this animal. I could see the shiny fur and that long tail as it walked past the door into the dining room. As I looked around the corner, it was gone. I went into freak-out mode, running throughout the whole house looking for it. It was gone. I have not seen it since. I've been researching all this time trying to figure out why it showed itself to me. My astral sign is Aries, my spirit animals are hawk, tiger, and jaguar, so I don't know if this was a panther or a jaguar spirit. I did not feel afraid of it when I saw it, just awestruck. It was solid black and had no spots on it that I could see. It was not see-through, but solid black. If you have any ideas, please let me know. I still haven't figured this out. Story 3. The year was 1999, and my ex-husband and I were living in Missouri then. My boys were just babies, 3 and 1. We had found a charming old farmhouse in the country, and the rent was very affordable. It was a 2-bedroom home that was situated at the top of a hill, and you had to drive up a long gravel driveway to get on it. On the property were several old farm buildings. One could tell that in its day it was top of the line. I assumed by the metal awnings over the windows that it was a thriving farm in the 1940s or 50s, but we fell in love with it and settled right in. We didn't live there long. If I had to guess, probably no more than 5 or 6 months. In the beginning, nothing seemed out of place, and we were quite happy there. although at night I would go and sit in the screened-in sun porch that overlooked the old buildings and always felt like I was being watched. You could always hear noises coming from the property at night, but that's to be expected. Needless to say, I would make my smoking trips limited. We had moved in around May or June, and Halloween was just around the corner. My ex-husband and I were out in the yard with the kids, looking at the old original well that had been sealed shut and wondered why they quit using it. The owners had dug a new well and put a well house around it. I don't remember why we ended up standing in the well house, but there we were looking down into the well. I made a comment on how creepy it was and wondered how deep it went. As we're looking down into this black hole, my ex-husband says, "Wait a minute, I think I see something." With that, he climbs in just a little, and then after a few minutes comes back out with something wooden. He hands it to me and I look it over. It's a tombstone. Because it was near Halloween, I assumed that one of the previous occupants had made a Halloween decoration. I decided it would be perfect out in the front yard and leaned it up against the fence, not giving it another thought. That is when it began. I had noticed our oldest boy, who was 3 at the time, start to detach from his brother. I would find him in different parts of the house playing by himself and talking to someone. I kind of wondered why he had quit playing with his brother, but didn't think too much about it. This went on for a little over a week's time. One afternoon, it was lunchtime, and I had called him into the kitchen to eat. He came in and engaged in full conversation with no one. I asked him who he was talking to. Now, mind you, he was 3, and his vocabulary was limited. He answers, "My friend." I say, "Oh, that's nice, buddy. Is your friend nice?" And he replies with a nod. More curious, I ask, "What does he look like?" He then shrugs his shoulders and says he has no head. I will admit that I was caught off guard by this. Following this conversation, I wouldn't allow him to play alone anymore, and he had quit talking to his imaginary friend during the day, and once again would play with his brother. It went on like that for the next 2 or 3 days, and I thought that perhaps whatever was going on had passed. That is until I woke up in the middle of the night to him, the 3-year-old, crying and shaking me. I assumed he had a bad dream and carried him back to bed. When I would put him back in the bed, he would just sit up and tell me he didn't want me to leave. I would sing him some songs and reassure him that it was only a dream. He would eventually lay back down and go to sleep. This had become a nightly ritual for about a week. During this week in the day, I decided to play a game of hide and seek with my boys, as we did all the time. I stood in the hallway and counted to 10. In this hallway, there was an odd cupboard that was the length of the hallway, but only about 3 feet in height. As I was counting to 10, I hear this cupboard door open, and I naturally think that the boys had chosen to hide there. So after reaching 10, I called out, "Ready or not, here I come," and start heading towards this cupboard, which I noticed one of the doors was cracked open. Completely convinced that my kid was hiding in there, I tiptoe to it and swing open the doors with a boo. To my surprise, there was no one there. I found it a bit odd, but that is all. When I found the boys, they had been hiding in the back of the house in the laundry room. That night, I awoke to my oldest boy screaming in his room. I rushed down the hall and into his room to find him sitting up in his bed shaking and crying. He seemed very upset. I asked him if he'd had a bad dream, and he tells me no. I then ask him, why is he crying? He then points to a set of cupboards in his room. These cupboards were all the way up on the wall, but near the bottom, where one oddly sized cupboard was pretty small, maybe big enough to fit a couple of shoe boxes. The door was open and he was pointing at it, so I walk over and shut it. He still just sits there staring at it and crying. I ask him what's wrong with the cupboard. He tells me that's where his friend stays. I tell him that would be impossible since the cupboard was so small. He tells me his friend won't leave him alone. I ask him what does his friend want. What he said next sent chills down my spine. He tells me that his friend was searching for something. I ask him what his friend was searching for. He tells me his head. This was pretty unsettling for me to think that my son was being trolled by such a thing at such a young age. I decided to become kind of aggressive with this friend and asked my son what his friend's name was. He says George. So out loud in a very confrontational voice I say, "Okay, George, I know you want to find your head, but my son is only 3 and needs sleep. He cannot help you find it, and you need to leave him alone, or you'll have to deal with me." My son kind of laughed. I guess he thought it was funny watching his mom yelling like that. I tucked him in and told him that if George tried to bother him again, to tell him to leave him alone, which proved to be ineffective. The nights to follow, I would wake up to my son screaming in his room, Only this time, when I would enter his room, he had hid under his bed. He would not open his eyes, and I picked him up and turned on the light. He claimed that George would not let him sleep and was mad. In order for all of us to get some sleep, I decided that moving the boys into my room was best. That seemed to work for the rest of the time that we lived there. On one of the last days that we were there, we were out in the yard, and the boys were playing as we'd done so many times. I'd forgotten about that wooden gravestone my ex-husband pulled out from the well previously. But here, I was sitting on the porch, and something urged me to really look at the piece of wood. I could see that there was writing on it. It was faded. I had noticed it when we found it, but I hadn't really took a look at it. It was just sitting there, and I was staring at it with the most overwhelming urge to go and read the writing. So that's what I did. As I began reading, I felt my heart sink. The name carved into the wood was George, along with a last name and a birth and death date. At the very bottom, there was a passage that was mostly worn away, making it impossible to read. However, the last few words remained intact, and it read, "He cannot rest until he finds his head." I had my ex-husband put that thing back where he found it. We packed up our things, loaded it into a trailer, and left that place as quickly as possible. Eventually, my oldest boy quit having night terrors, and things returned to normal. I had hoped that if it was never brought up, he would forget about seeing it, since he was only 3 when it happened. But years later, when he was about 13 or so, he brought it up and had some questions. I was stunned that he could remember that. About a year ago, I wanted to see if anyone was living there, so I looked it up on Google Earth, and it is no longer there. I wonder if George ever found his head. Story 4. My husband and I moved into the apartment we currently reside in a little over 2 years ago. It's quite spacious and has updated amenities. There is a master bedroom with a full bath attached and a guest bedroom with a restroom just outside of it. We live on the top floor of a 3-story apartment building and have only one neighbor with whom we share a wall with that is seldom noisy. With that being said, there have been a few instances where I've questioned what I saw and heard. The first few months that we lived there, I'd noticed that the hall light outside of both bedrooms would be on in the morning 2 or 3 times a week. At first, I thought surely it was one of us leaving it on at night and forgetting that we had. Then, after several occurrences, and both my husband and I denying that we left the light on, I decided to verbally acknowledge that I was turning it off. I looked at my husband before we went into the master bedroom that night and said, "Okay, this is me turning off the light, so we know for certain that it should be off in the morning." I said it jokingly, but part of me was serious and needed an explanation. There would be no reason for him or I to venture out in the night because there's a bathroom in the master bedroom, and we always came to bed with full bottles of water. You can imagine my surprise in the morning when I came out while my husband still slept and found the light on yet again. The switch turned up and all. This made my hair stand on end. However, as time went on, the light being on in the hallway lessened and has finally stopped about 6 months ago. I've tried to come up with an explanation for it, and the only thing I could think of is that I may be sleepwalking, which is something I used to do up until about 5 years ago. I don't think this is likely, though, because my husband says he hasn't seen me do it since, and he always used to catch me doing it, from what he tells me, as I, of course, have no memory of it. The next instance happened about a year ago in the master bedroom. I was asleep and was awoken abruptly by a soft sound, or a thud, or a pop. The south side of the bedroom has a door that leads to the balcony and always has a bit of light shining through its blind due to the street lights in the parking lot below. As I woke, I turned my head towards the door and saw what looked to be a silhouette of a person standing about a foot in front of it. There was no features, but I could tell by its shoulders and its torso that the figure was male, perhaps about 5'7", and it was wearing a hat. Our bed sits opposite the door, so the figure was turned directly towards us, about 7 feet from the head of my bed. I was so startled that I jolted out of bed and turned on the light for the entire room. My husband was confused, and I didn't explain until morning to him what I had seen. Of course, there was nothing there. My heart would not stop pounding for about 30 minutes after the incident. I tried rationalizing what I saw as a dream leaked over into reality, if you know what I mean. I had a similar instance happen to me when I was about 14 and saw a figure directly next to my bed standing and looking down. It was so close to my bedside lamp that I thought my eyes had played a trick on me. but at the time it felt so real. That figure also vanished as soon as I turned on the light. The final and most significant thing happened to me last night, leading to me writing down all of these occurrences. I was laying on my side of the bed, right side, which has a nightstand and a lamp directly next to it. If you were to lay on your side facing out, you'd be facing a window that lets a little light in, much like the patio door. I fell asleep at about 11:30 p.m. and woke facing the outside exactly 45 minutes later. I checked the clock. I don't know why I woke up, but I immediately noticed something on my nightstand. It was roughly the size of a bird, and that was what my brain made it to be. It was completely black and sitting about a foot from my face. I then saw it move to the left, much like the movement of a bird walking, with a little sway. I was so frightened, I yet again jumped out of my bed and turned on the light, fully expecting there to be a creature on my nightstand. As you can guess, there was nothing when I looked. I checked high and low, no sign of anything, and there had been no noise. I told my husband what I saw. He thought it might have been a dream leaking into reality again. But to me it was so vivid that I was nearly positive there was an animal in the room. I was so exhausted that I wasn't even afraid to turn the light off and attempt to go back to sleep. Here's the odd part. Almost instantly after turning off the light, a memory of my grandfather came into my mind. I could see and hear him so clearly as I lay there trying to fall back to sleep, and the thought of him and his voice eventually led me to drift off. He passed away a little over 4 years ago. There was no reason for me to be thinking of him, and I did not even question it until the morning. Was it him that I saw? A ghost? A dream? Or something else? I'll likely never know.